It was June 14, 1998, and the Delta Center in Salt Lake City was carrying the specific weight of a building that understands something permanent is about to be decided. The Chicago Bulls trailed the Utah Jazz by 1 point with 41 seconds remaining in Game 6 of the NBA Finals. Everything that had been built across 6 years of championships, across the dynasty that had redefined what professional basketball could look like when the right collection of people committed to the right system under the right leadership, had arrived at this single possession. Win, and the dynasty closed on its own terms. Lose, and the series went to a Game 7 that nobody could predict with confidence, in a building that had already proven it could produce outcomes that the Bulls preferred not to repeat. The Utah Jazz had earned everything about that moment. Karl Malone and John Stockton represented one of the most refined partnerships in the history of professional sport. Two players whose individual excellence expressed itself most completely in relation to each other, whose pick-and-roll combination had been executed so many thousands of times that it had achieved a quality of inevitability that opposing coaches spent entire off-seasons trying to solve and never fully solved. They had reached the finals the previous year and lost to the Bulls in 6 games. And the loss had produced in the Utah organization the particular kind of motivation that only a finals defeat generates, a specific and sustained hunger to return and correct the outcome with the same opponent. They had done exactly that. They had returned, pushed the series to 6 games, and now trailed by 1 possession with 41 seconds remaining. The margin was minimal. The outcome was genuinely uncertain. Bryon Russell had been assigned the primary defensive responsibility for Jordan throughout the series. This required understanding what Russell actually was as a defender, because the assignment was not symbolic and it was not punitive. Russell was 6'7", legitimately athletic, capable of using his length and his preparation against elite offensive players in ways that smaller or less disciplined defenders could not. He had competed against Jordan across multiple playoff series, and had accumulated through that competition a specific and detailed understanding of Jordan's tendencies, his preferred spots on the floor, the subtle indicators in his footwork that preceded different offensive decisions. He was not operating under any illusion about stopping Jordan completely, because nobody in the league operated under that illusion. His assignment was to make Jordan work for everything, to deny the easiest versions of his preferred actions, and to force the most difficult execution of whatever Jordan was going to do regardless. What added a specific texture to the matchup in 1998 was the history carried over from the previous year. In the 1997 finals, in a critical late-game situation, Russell had been guarding Jordan when Jordan executed a crossover and created enough separation to score a significant basket. After that game, Russell said in an interview that he believed Jordan had extended his left hand against Russell's hip before the crossover, creating space through contact that should have been called as an offensive foul. The comment circulated through the basketball world without generating enormous controversy, because it was stated as an honest observation rather than a complaint, but it had become part of the background texture of their individual competition. Jordan knew about it. Russell knew Jordan knew. These things accumulate between players who face each other repeatedly in high-stakes settings, and they become part of the psychological architecture that shapes what happens when they meet again. Phil Jackson called timeout with 41 seconds remaining and the Bulls trailing by 1. The huddle, as described by people positioned close enough to observe it, had a quality of calm that was incongruous with the circumstances unless you understood that the calm was itself a product of the circumstances, specifically of Jordan's effect on the collective psychological state of the team in exactly these moments. His demeanor in late-game situations had always operated as a form of silent communication to his teammates, telling them through his own stillness and focus that the situation was one he had been in before, and that the outcome was something he had already processed. Scottie Pippen said in later years that competing alongside Jordan in critical moments meant competing alongside someone who had already determined the result in some interior space that the game itself was simply catching up to. The play Jackson drew up was a framework rather than a rigid script. Complexity in final possessions is a liability because it requires precise execution under conditions that make precision unreliable. And Jackson had learned over years of coaching Jordan that the most effective instruction was instruction that created space for Jordan's instincts to operate, rather than instruction that tried to direct those instincts toward predetermined outcomes. The core of what Jackson communicated was simple: clear the strong side, get Jordan the ball, give him room, trust what happens next. Jordan brought the ball up court with the deliberateness of someone managing time as consciously as he was managing everything else. He needed a basket, but he also needed to ensure that whatever happened offensively left Utah with the minimum possible time to respond. He advanced slowly, reading the Jazz defense as it organized itself around him, watching Russell's positioning, noting where the help defenders were stationed, processing in the seconds available every variable that would inform the decision approaching. Russell was set in a good defensive stance. This was the honest assessment of people who analyzed the subsequent possession without the outcome already loaded into their interpretation. He was not overplaying a direction or committing prematurely to a read that Jordan could exploit. He was balanced, active, giving Jordan the respect of a genuinely prepared defensive presence without conceding any obvious advantage. Everything his preparation had given him was present in his stance. The problem was not his preparation or the quality of his execution. The problem was the specific identity of the player he was executing it against. Jordan came off a screen from Tony Kukoc on the left side and received the ball at the top of the key, with Russell working hard to recover position in front of him. For a fraction of a second, the two men were facing each other in the pure form of the contest. Everything else stripped away, the entire game reduced to the question of what happens when these two specific people occupy this specific space with this specific amount on the line. Russell was close enough to contest a jump shot. He was back enough to prevent a direct drive. He was, by every available measure of defensive positioning, in the right place. Jordan put the ball on the floor to his right, a hard, decisive dribble designed to establish whether Russell would commit to the direction. Russell moved with it without overcommitting, the correct response. Jordan brought the ball back left with a crossover, and this is where the possession entered the territory that has been examined and argued and analyzed by basketball people for the more than 2 decades since it occurred. The crossover was accompanied by a movement of Jordan's left arm that made contact with Russell's right side. Whether that contact was the incidental physical proximity of two athletes moving at speed in opposite directions or a deliberate extension designed to create separation is a question that depends significantly on what framework the person answering it brings to the viewing. What is beyond dispute is the effect. Russell's momentum carried him a step in the direction Jordan had come from. The gap created between them was small in absolute terms and decisive in basketball terms. Jordan stopped on a dime. The phrase is used so frequently in basketball description that it has lost most of its meaning, but in this instance it described something physically precise, a deceleration from movement to complete stillness achieved in a space of inches, the kind of stop that requires years of specific physical training to produce reliably, and that Jordan had been producing reliably for 15 years. Russell was a step behind him in recovering. Jordan elevated from approximately 15 feet on the right side of the key, his body moving through the mechanics of a jump shot that had been repeated so many tens of thousands of times in practice and in games across his entire career that the mechanics had long since ceased to be conscious acts and had become something closer to automatic processes that his competitive will activated rather than directed. His elevation was not the explosive vertical of his younger years. He was 35 years old, and the jump was the jump of a 35-year-old who had spent 15 years subjecting his body to the physical demands of professional basketball at the highest level. What it retained was the timing, the release point at the apex, the follow-through that coaches and analysts had cited for years as the most consistently reproduced in the sport. Russell's hand was in his face. Not a decorative contest, not a gesture toward defense. His length was genuinely present, genuinely contesting, representing the best physical effort available to him in the time the sequence had allowed. The ball went in. The Bulls led by 1. The Delta Center went quiet in the specific register that distinguishes the silence of a crowd that has been expecting something and received something else from ordinary crowd silence. It was the silence of collective recalibration. 8,000 people processing the gap between the outcome they had been invested in and the outcome that had just occurred, needing a moment before the noise returned, carrying the desperate frequency of a building that understands it needs something extraordinary in the time remaining. Utah got the ball and ran their offense with the controlled urgency of a team that has not yet accepted that the game is over. Stockton advanced it, the Jazz executed their actions, and with 6 seconds remaining, Stockton found a look at a three-pointer from the right wing that could have changed the entire conversation. The shot went up and missed. Jordan gathered the rebound, and the game belonged to history. The Bulls won by 1. The dynasty was complete. 6 championships in 8 years, the last 3 consecutive. The entire second run built on the foundation of a return that the basketball world had questioned, and Jordan had answered with 3 straight titles and a final sequence in Salt Lake City that would be watched and discussed for as long as the sport was played. The images from the floor of the Delta Center after the final buzzer became among the most reproduced in American sports photography. Jordan with his fist raised and his eyes closed, the release of everything the season and the series and the preceding years had required concentrated into a single gesture. Pippen embracing him with the force of someone who understood completely what they had shared and what it had demanded. Jackson moving through his players with the quiet acknowledgement of a man who knew the building was finished, that the particular configuration of people and talent and commitment that had produced something extraordinary was experiencing its last moment as a unit, and that the moment required recognition rather than celebration. Bryon Russell sat on the Delta Center floor briefly after the buzzer. His posture communicated what his face confirmed, the specific exhaustion of someone who had competed at the absolute limit of his capacity and arrived at an outcome that this level of competition did not deserve to produce but had produced regardless. He had been in the right position. He had read the play correctly. He had contested the shot with everything his preparation had given him. The outcome had not rewarded his preparation, which was not a statement about the inadequacy of his preparation, but about the person his preparation had been applied against. In the press conference that followed, Jordan addressed the final possession with the economy that characterized his public language about his own performances. He said the play was one he had made before, and that when the situation presented itself, he trusted what his preparation had built and executed without thinking about what the execution meant. He said it plainly, without the kind of retrospective drama that the moment might have invited, because the drama had already happened on the floor and needed nothing added to it. Russell addressed the possession in interviews conducted over the following days with a directness that reflected his character. He said he had competed as well as he knew how to compete against the best player he had ever faced in a high-stakes situation. He acknowledged the contact question without bitterness, saying that contact in late-game situations was part of basketball at every level, and that officials make the calls they make in real time without the benefit of the replays that everyone else uses to form opinions afterward. He said he had no regrets about how he competed in the series or on that possession specifically, and then he said something that reframed the question of what it meant to have been the defender in that moment. He said that being close enough to contest the most famous shot in the most important game of a championship series was its own form of distinction. That most players in the history of the sport never stood that close to something that significant. That he had been there, had competed completely, and that Jordan had made the shot anyway, and that the shot being made despite his complete effort said something about Jordan that no amount of comfortable distance from the situation could say as clearly. The 1998 championship was the last thing the dynasty produced. Jordan retired that summer for the second time. Jackson left. Pippen pursued free agency. The roster that had won 72 games and carried the sport to a level of global visibility it had never previously achieved dispersed in the way that extraordinary collections of people and talent inevitably disperse when the circumstances that assembled them have run their natural course. What remained was permanent in the way that finishes are permanent. The crossover, the stop, the elevation. Russell's hand in Jordan's face, the ball leaving Jordan's hand at the apex of his jump with the follow-through that thousands of repetitions had made automatic. The net moving, the lead, the rebound at the end, the fist, the closed eyes. The dynasty finished on its own terms by the person who had built it, in the building that had most wanted to prevent it, with the player who had prepared most specifically to stop it, unable to stop it, not because of any failure on his part, but because of what Jordan was in the moments that defined his career. Present, complete. Executing the thing he had spent his entire life learning to execute at the exact moment when everything depended on its execution. The last sentence of the greatest story professional basketball had ever produced, written in Salt Lake City on a June evening, 41 seconds from the end, 15 feet from the basket, with one hand in his face and everything on the line.